The sound of the great oak door closing was not a slam, but a deep, resonant thud that vibrated through the floorboards and settled in the marrow of her bones. It was the sound of a period being placed at the end of a long, miserable sentence, the final punctuation on 18 years of institutional life. Elara stood on the stone steps, a thin coat pulled tight against a wind that carried the city's damp chill, and watched the polished brass handle gleam one last time before the shadow of the portico consumed it. She was, in the clipped, indifferent language of the state, an adult. She was, in the stark reality of the moment, utterly and completely alone, an island in the indifferent stream of passersby who hurried along the pavement, their faces set toward destinations she could not imagine. The world, which had always been a distant concept viewed through dormitory windows, was now a vast, intimidating presence, and she had been expelled into its heart, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small, sealed manila envelope. The envelope was handed to her by a tired woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun, a woman whose face Elara had seen 1,000 times, but whose name she had never learned. The woman had not met her eyes. Her voice was a monotone recitation of official policy, a script worn smooth by countless repetitions. Inside the envelope, which felt insultingly light, lay the entirety of her worldly inheritance. There was a thin stack of bills amounting to $112, the state's final, frugal investment in her future. Beneath the cash was a single sheet of brittle, yellowed paper folded into a precise square, the deed to a property. The address was a string of unfamiliar names, followed by the designation Lot 7, Iffelberg Rise. The woman had offered a dry, humorless smile, as she explained it was the only possession left by a great-grandfather Elara had never known, a man the state's records noted only as a reclusive eccentric. The property, the woman had added with a hint of pity that felt sharper than any insult, was considered worthless, its tax arrears paid by the state for decades more out of bureaucratic inertia than any perceived value. The final item in the envelope, nestled in a fold of the deed, was a key. It was not a modern key of serrated brass, but a heavy, pitted piece of iron, its shaft thick and its bit a complex floral shape. It felt ancient, a relic from a forgotten lock, and its cold weight in her palm was the only thing that felt substantial. A joke, the woman's tone had implied. A final, cruel folly from a dead man to a girl the world had already discarded. The journey north was a slow, rattling exorcism of everything she had ever known. First, a bus sighed its way out of the city's gray embrace, its windows streaked with grime that turned the passing landscape into a watercolor blur. Then came a train, its rhythmic clatter a monotonous heartbeat counting down the miles, carrying her deeper into a country that grew progressively wilder and more severe. The gentle, rolling hills of her youth flattened, then buckled, rising into jagged, stone-toothed mountains that clawed at a perpetually overcast sky. The air grew thinner, colder, and when she finally disembarked at a tiny, wind-scoured station, the silence was a physical pressure against her eardrums. The final leg of the journey was on foot. A rutted track, little more than a suggestion of a road, wound its way up from the valley floor, ascending into the highlands. With each step, the last vestiges of civilization fell away, replaced by sweeping expanses of brown heather and weathered granite. The wind was no longer a city breeze, but a living entity, a relentless predator that howled through the passes and tore at her thin coat, seeking out every seam and gap with icy fingers. She walked for hours, her meager bag digging into her shoulder, the iron key a cold lump in her pocket, until the track crested a final rise, and she saw it. The sight that greeted her was not a home, not even a shelter, but a wound in the earth. The word ruin was too gentle, too romantic for the skeletal wreckage that clung to the mountainside. What remained of her inheritance was a jagged spine of a stone chimney, listing at a drunken angle as if weary of its long battle with the wind. Around it, a few broken walls stood like shattered teeth, their mortar long since turned to dust and blown away. The roof was gone entirely, its great timbers scattered and rotted into the soil, leaving the interior open to the unforgiving sky. A gaping black rectangle suggested a doorway, and another, a window, framing a desolate view of the opposite peak. To one side of the collapsed structure, a curtain of water fell from a high ledge, a perpetual, mournful whisper that fed a small moss-choked stream. The wind, her constant companion, swirled through the broken stones with a low, guttural moan, a sound of utter desolation. This was not a fixer-upper. It was a grave. The state's assessment had not been pessimistic. It had been generous. This was less than worthless. It was a monument to failure, a final, definitive statement on her place in the world. For 3 days, despair was a physical shroud, heavy and suffocating. Elara found the most sheltered corner of the ruin, a nook formed by 2 sections of wall that still met, and huddled there, drawing her knees to her chest. She managed to build a small, pathetic fire from scavenged, damp wood, but it offered more smoke than heat, a sputtering, sullen thing that seemed to mock her with its weakness. The flames licked feebly at the blackened stones of the hearth, casting flickering, distorted shadows that danced like specters in the encroaching twilight. Her food, a few loaves of bread and a wedge of hard cheese, dwindled with alarming speed. Each bite was a conscious calculation, a desperate piece of arithmetic against the coming hunger. The cold was a constant, seeping ache that worked its way deep into her muscles, leaving her stiff and slow. Sleep was a shallow, fitful thing, punctuated by the howling of the wind and the skittering of unseen creatures in the rubble. In the long, dark hours, the thought of surrender was a seductive whisper. She could walk back down the mountain. She could find the nearest town and beg, or offer herself up to whatever grim fate awaited a penniless, friendless woman. She could simply lie down and let the cold take her, a quiet, passive end to a quiet, passive life. The sheer totality of the ruin's failure mirrored the emptiness inside her, and for those 3 days, she saw no difference between its collapse and her own. The change came not as a gradual dawn, but as a sudden violent spark on the 4th day. She was staring blankly at the ground, her mind a numb landscape of grey thoughts, when her eyes fixed upon a small patch of heather growing from a crack in a fallen lintel. It was a tough, wiry little plant, its purple flowers incongruously vibrant against the drab stone. The wind tore at it, bent it nearly double, but it did not break. It clung to its precarious hold with a stubborn, mindless tenacity. It simply endured. And as she watched it, something inside her shifted. The cold, heavy blanket of despair began to burn away, replaced by a different kind of heat. It was a hot, clean, clarifying rage. A rage against the woman with the severe bun, against the indifferent state, against the long-dead great-grandfather who had bequeathed her this pile of rocks. A rage against the wind that sought to scour her from the mountain, and the cold that sought to invade her bones. They had all judged her, written her off, left her here to fail. They had looked at her and seen nothing of value. The world had pushed her to the edge, expecting her to fall. And in that moment, staring at a defiant sprig of heather, she decided she would not. She would not surrender. She would fight. The anger was a fire in her belly, far warmer than the pathetic flames in the hearth. It burned away the paralysis and left behind a core of cold, hard resolve. Her first act of agency was not grand or strategic. It was simple, mindless, physical labor. She stood up, her joints protesting, and grabbed the nearest loose stone. It was heavy, its edges sharp against her soft palms. With a grunt, she heaved it from the pile of debris that choked the floor of the ruin and tossed it aside. Then she picked up another, and another. For the rest of that day and all of the next, she worked. She cleared the rubble from the foundation, sorting the stones into rough piles, large intact blocks here, smaller shattered pieces there. It was grueling, back-breaking work. Her muscles, unused to such strain, screamed in protest. Her hands, uncalloused, were quickly raw and bleeding. Sweat mingled with the grime on her face, but the physical pain was a welcome anesthetic, a sharp, clean sensation that drowned out the dull ache of despair. With every stone she moved, she was imposing a small pocket of order on the surrounding chaos. She was not rebuilding, she was excavating. She was clearing the ground, not yet to build something new, but simply to quiet the screaming voice in her head that told her it was all hopeless. The rhythm of the labor, bend, lift, heave, repeat, became a meditation, a physical prayer of defiance against the crushing weight of her circumstances. The shovel struck metal with a jarring clang that vibrated up the wooden handle and into her arms. She had been clearing the deepest part of the ruin, the area directly in front of the great stone hearth, a space filled with a century of compacted earth and debris. For days her work had been a monotonous struggle against stone and soil. This new sound, sharp and resonant, was an anomaly. Curiosity overriding her exhaustion, she fell to her knees and began to dig with her hands, scraping away the damp earth. Slowly, a flat, dark surface emerged. It was the lid of a container, a heavy, iron-banded chest, its wood swollen and blackened by age and moisture. It was locked, a formidable iron plate with a keyhole of the same strange, floral shape as the key in her pocket. Her heart began to beat a frantic, hopeful rhythm against her ribs. With trembling, dirt-caked fingers, she retrieved the heavy iron key. It felt different now. No longer a piece of a cruel joke, but a potential answer. She slid it into the lock. It resisted at first, clogged with rust and time, but with a firm, steady pressure, it sank home. She turned it. There was a moment of grinding protest, a groan of metal on metal, and then a loud, satisfying click echoed in the silence of the ruin. With a deep breath, she lifted the heavy lid. The air that rose from the chest was a scent of another time, a dry, dusty smell of leather, paper, and faint chemical traces. Inside, protected from the damp by a lining of tarnished copper, lay the legacy of her ancestor. There was no gold, no jewels, no material wealth of any kind. Instead, there was knowledge. A thick, leather-bound journal sat atop a collection of rolled schematics, tied with faded ribbon. She lifted the journal, its cover soft and worn beneath her fingers, and opened it. The pages were filled with a dense, elegant script, interspersed with complex diagrams and mathematical formulas. It was the life's work of Alistair, her great-grandfather, a man the world had dismissed as an eccentric, but who, these pages revealed, was a brilliant, visionary engineer, a scientist far ahead of his time. He wrote not of conventional building, but of a philosophy. He saw the mountain not as an obstacle to be conquered, but as a partner. He wrote of the wind not as an enemy, but as an engine. He wrote of the cold not as a threat, but as a source of potential energy. The schematics, when she carefully unrolled them, were not for a house. They were for a system. He called it the Ethelberg system, a sophisticated, nature-integrated method of survival that relied on thermal mass, passive geothermal exchange, and a profound understanding of thermodynamics. It was a blueprint for a shelter that did not fight the winter, but harnessed its power. The central component of Alistair's design was a high-mass masonry stove, a kachelofen, as he called it, a towering structure of brick and stone, designed not to radiate intense direct heat, but to absorb the energy of a single, hot, fast-burning fire, and then slowly, gently, release that warmth for 24 hours or more. It was a thermal battery, a warm heart for the home. But this was only half of the genius. The other half lay behind the waterfall. The schematics showed the stove was connected via a complex network of insulated, stone-lined ducts to a shaft hidden behind the cascade of water. He described it as an abandoned prospector's mine, a deep, stable environment where the Earth's temperature remained a constant, cool but not freezing, 50 degrees year-round. The system was designed to draw this stable, pre-warmed air from the mine, circulate it through the thermal mass of the stove, and then distribute it throughout the living space. It was a passive geothermal heat exchange system of breathtaking elegance. The ruin was not a failed house. It was an unfinished masterpiece. Alistair had not been a fool. He had been a prophet, building a fortress against a world he knew would only grow colder. Her plan, once a vague and desperate notion of survival, was now a clear, audacious purpose. She would not rebuild the house that had been. She would complete the shelter Alistair had designed. This was no longer about simple defiance. It was about vindication, for herself and for the ancestor she had never known. The work shifted from demolition to construction, from mindless labor to a focused, intellectual challenge. She spent her nights by the fire, poring over the journal and the schematics until she understood every curve of every duct, every ratio of the mortar mix, every principle of airflow and heat retention. By day, she became a mason, a laborer, an engineer. She used the stones she had cleared, learning to shape them, to fit them together. She rebuilt the collapsed walls, not as they had been, but thicker, stronger, integrating the channels and vents Alistair's designs demanded. She worked from dawn until dusk, her body fueled by a dwindling supply of food, but her spirit fueled by a burning, unshakable resolve. She was no longer just surviving. She was creating. She was building a fortress, a sanctuary, a living machine made of stone and wisdom, a direct contradiction to every conventional idea of what a home should be. The journey to town was a necessity she could no longer avoid. The project demanded materials she could not scavenge from the mountain: fire bricks for the stove's core, rock wool for insulation, special heat-resistant mortar, and a few lengths of precisely engineered metal pipe specified in Alistair's diagrams. She walked down the mountain track, a different person from the hopeless girl who had walked up it weeks before. Her face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp, but her eyes held a new, focused intensity that made people stare. Her clothes were torn and stained with dirt and stone dust, and her hands were a geography of calluses and healing cuts. She was a wild thing, a creature of the mountain, and she felt the weight of the town's curious, judgmental gazes as she walked its single paved street. The town of Jasper Creek was a small, pragmatic place, nestled in the valley as if hiding from the harshness of the surrounding peaks. It was a community that valued conformity and trusted only in what had been done before. Her list of supplies drew a sneer from the man behind the counter of the general store. He was a large man with a florid face and a self-important air, the kind of man whose opinions were always loud and always certain. His name, she learned from the sign above the store, was Mr. Boren, and he was clearly a figure of authority in the town. He looked at her list, then at her disheveled appearance, and chuckled, a condescending, rumbling sound. Fire bricks? Rock wool? What in God's name was a girl like her doing with this? Building a proper furnace, he advised, was a man's job. He gestured to the pot-bellied stoves for sale in the corner of his store. That's what you need, girl. A good, honest iron stove. You feed it wood, it gives you heat. Simple. He publicly predicted her failure, his voice loud enough for the other patrons to hear. She'd be dead before the first snows of the wolf winter, he declared, using the local term for the harshest part of the season. A little thing like you, alone on Ethelberg Rise? That's not a home, it's a tomb. Alistair's Folly, they called it. and it seems the folly runs in the family." His words were meant to be arrows, to pierce her resolve and send her scurrying back down the mountain in shame, but they had the opposite effect. His loud, arrogant certainty was the perfect foil to her great-grandfather's quiet, patient wisdom. His mockery was a whetstone, and on it her resolve was honed to a razor's edge. The cost of the materials, when Boren finally tallied it with a flourish of derision, was far more than the $112 she possessed. A wave of cold dread washed over her, a fear more chilling than any mountain wind. For a moment, she saw her entire project collapsing, undone by the simple, brutal reality of commerce. As she stood there, shame and frustration warring within her, another man spoke. He was older, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands thick and calloused from a lifetime of work. He had been sitting quietly in a corner, observing the exchange. He introduced himself as Silas, the owner of the town's small lumber mill. He walked over, looked at her list, then looked at her hands. He didn't ask about her plan. He didn't offer advice. He just looked at the evidence of her labor written on her skin. "That's a fool's gamble up there," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "But you've got the grit of a quarrier. I'll wager on grit over talk any day." He turned to a stunned Mr. Boren. "Put it on my account. She can pay me back in the spring, if she's still around." It was not an act of charity. It was a wager, a vote of confidence not in her success, but in the ferocity of her effort. It was the first time anyone had looked at her and seen strength instead of weakness, and the quiet, grudging validation from this skeptical old man meant more to her than all the gold in the world. The news of the coming storm arrived not as a rumor, but as an official, bone-chilling proclamation. Radio broadcasts crackled with warnings from the National Weather Service. Meteorologists used grave, apocalyptic language, speaking of a convergence of Arctic fronts, a once-in-a-century weather event. They called it a blizzard, but the locals knew it by its older, more fearsome name. The wolf winter was coming. A storm that would last not for days, but for weeks. A siege of unimaginable cold and snow. The town of Jasper Creek descended into a frenzy of panicked preparation. The air filled with the shriek of chainsaws as men worked feverishly to build towering wood piles. The shelves of Boren's store were stripped bare of canned goods, batteries, and fuel. The prevailing wisdom, championed loudly and insistently by Mr. Boren himself, was one of brute force. The only way to survive a great cold was with a great fire. "Stockpile fuel," he bellowed to anyone who would listen. "Keep your stoves roaring day and night." It was a simple, aggressive, and deeply flawed strategy, a war of detertion against an enemy with infinite reserves. While the town scrambled in a noisy panic, Elara's preparations were a study in quiet, methodical calm. Her work on the Athelberg system was nearly complete. She had rebuilt the core of the ruin into a small, fortress-like shelter, a single snug room of thick stone walls and a low, insulated roof. The great masonry stove stood against the back wall, a monolithic altar of fire brick and stone. The ducts were all in place, a hidden circulatory system connecting the stove, the living space, and the mine shaft that lay behind the waterfall. Her woodpile was shockingly small, a neat, modest stack that would have earned her Boren's loudest scorn. It was all she would need. Her final act of preparation was not to stockpile, but to prime. On the day before the first flakes of snow began to fall, she built a single, intensely hot fire in the core of the stove. She used her best, driest wood, feeding the flames until they roared, a contained inferno that sent a column of clean, white smoke into the heavy gray sky. For 6 hours she fed the fire, pouring heat and energy into the tons of stone and brick. The stove's outer surface grew warm, then hot, a massive reservoir of stored thermal energy. Then, as the last of the wood turned to glowing embers, she sealed the flue, closed the iron door to the firebox, and opened the intake vent from the mine. The Ethelberg system was charged. There was nothing left to do but wait. The storm arrived as a whisper, a few scattered snowflakes spiraling in the wind. Then the whisper became a roar. The sky vanished, replaced by a churning, blinding wall of white. The wind shrieked, a physical force that slammed into the mountainside, shaking the very stones of her shelter. The temperature plummeted. In the town of Jasper Creek, the battle began. Families huddled around their iron stoves, feeding them constantly. The initial mood was one of defiant confidence, the roar of the fires a match for the roar of the wind. But the stoves were ravenous. They consumed wood at a terrifying rate, and the heat they produced was fierce but fleeting. It baked the area directly around them, while leaving the corners of the rooms shockingly cold. Drafts snaked in through every crack. The frantic, brute force approach was failing. Wood piles that had seemed immense began to shrink with alarming speed. The constant labor of feeding the fire became an exhausting, round-the-clock chore. Fear began to creep in, cold and insidious as the drafts. The generators powering the few modern furnaces sputtered and died as their fuel lines froze. The town, for all its bluster and preparation, was losing its war against the cold. Homes became iceboxes, their inhabitants trapped in a desperate, losing struggle. Inside Elara's shelter, there was no struggle. There was only a profound and absolute silence, broken only by the muffled howl of the wind outside, a distant, powerless threat. The air was not hot, but deeply, thoroughly warm, a gentle, radiant heat that emanated from the very walls around her. The great masonry stove was a silent, benevolent giant, its surface radiating a constant, steady warmth that filled every corner of the small room. The floor stones were warm under her feet. The air she breathed was fresh and clean, drawn from the deep, stable earth through the mine shaft, stripped of its subterranean chill as it passed through the stove's thermal heart. There was no smoke, no drafts, no ravenous fire to feed. The single hot fire she had built days ago was now a vast reservoir of energy, slowly and efficiently bleeding its life into her sanctuary. She had an abundance of food, a stack of books recovered from the chest, and a quiet, unshakable sense of security. While the town fought a desperate, losing battle, she rested. While they shivered in fear, she lived in peace. She was not surviving the storm. She was thriving within it. The Ethelberg system was not just a shelter. It was a different reality, a pocket of quiet warmth and order carved from the heart of the howling chaos. The wolf winter raged for 3 weeks. When it finally broke, the world it revealed was both beautiful and lethal. A thick, pristine blanket of snow, 20 feet deep in places, covered everything, smoothing the harsh angles of the landscape into soft, white curves. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the air was so cold it felt like shattered glass in the lungs. Elara emerged from her shelter into this transformed world, blinking in the bright sunlight. Her small fortress was a haven of impossible warmth in a world of absolute zero. A steady plume of warm, moist air rose from the exhaust vent on her roof, the only sign of the life within. It had melted the snow directly above it, creating a small, green patch of exposed stone, an island of temperate reality in an Arctic sea. In the valley, the people of Jasper Creek emerged from their homes like survivors of a siege, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollowed by exhaustion and fear. The town was devastated. Pipes had burst. Livestock had frozen. The great wood piles were gone, reduced to ash, and the cold had won. It was Silas who organized the rescue party. He feared the worst for the strange, determined girl on the mountain. With him were 3 other townsmen, and, reluctantly, Mr. Boren, his authority now muted by the shared trauma of the storm. Their trek up the mountain was an arduous, exhausting ordeal, a slow march through waist-deep snow. They expected to find a tomb, a snow-covered mound where the ruin had been, and they spoke in low, somber tones about the folly of youth and the unforgiving nature of the mountains. As they crested the final rise, they stopped, confused. They saw not a burial mound, but a small, sturdy stone structure, and rising from its roof was a faint, shimmering heat haze, a sign of life so incongruous in the frozen landscape that it seemed like a hallucination. Cautiously, they approached the door. Silas knocked, his fist making a dull thud. When there was no answer, he pushed it open. They were met not by a gust of frigid air, but by a solid, palpable wall of warmth. It flowed out of the doorway like a gentle river, carrying the scent of dried herbs and warm stone. Inside, they found Elara sitting at a small wooden table, reading one of her great-grandfather's books by the light of a single candle. She was calm, healthy, and surrounded by a profound sense of peace. She looked up, unsurprised, as if she had been expecting them. The men stood in the doorway, dumbfounded, their breath pluming in the cold air behind them, while their faces were caressed by the impossible warmth from within. They stared at the massive, silent stove, at the clean, dry floor, at the thriving human being in the heart of the winter. It was Mr. Boren who finally broke the silence, his voice a choked whisper of disbelief. How is this possible? Your fire should have been out for weeks. You have no wood. How? His entire worldview, built on the simple, brute force logic of bigger fires and more fuel, had crumbled in the face of this quiet, warm reality. He could not comprehend a system that worked with such subtle, patient efficiency. He was looking at a miracle, and it shattered his arrogant certainty into 1,000 pieces. Elara did not gloat. She simply explained. She told them of Alastair, the visionary. She described the principle of the thermal battery, of storing heat in mass rather than constantly generating it. She led them outside and showed them the hidden intake behind the waterfall, explaining how the system breathed in the stable air of the deep earth. She spoke of harmony, not of battle. She spoke of working with the mountain, not against it. Her explanation was simple, elegant, and for Boren, utterly humiliating. The townsmen looked from the thriving girl to their own frostbitten faces, from her tiny woodpile to the memory of their own frantic, failed efforts. The truth was undeniable. In that moment, Boren's authority, built on loud opinions and conventional wisdom, evaporated. He was not a leader. He was a fool, and his foolishness had nearly cost them everything. He turned without another word and began the long, shameful walk back down the mountain, his public failure as complete and devastating as his initial arrogance had been grand. He left Jasper Creek a week later and was never seen again. The narrative of Athelberg Rise changed overnight. What was once Alastair's folly became Elara's hearth. She was no longer the strange outcast, the mad woman on the mountain. She was a figure of awe and respect, a custodian of a forgotten wisdom that had proven superior to everything they thought they knew. The townspeople began to make pilgrimages to her home, not to gawk, but to learn. They came with questions, with notebooks, with a newfound humility. At first, she was hesitant, a quiet, solitary person unused to being the center of attention. But she saw the genuine need in their eyes, the desperate desire to understand, to be better prepared for the next wolf winter. And so, she became a teacher. She shared the pages of Alastair's journal freely, translating his complex engineering principles into practical lessons that the town's masons and builders could understand. She taught them not just how to build a stove, but how to think differently about the world, to see the resources and allies hidden in plain sight. Years passed. The town of Jasper Creek was transformed. The ugly, inefficient iron stoves were gradually replaced by elegant, efficient masonry heaters, each one built with local stone and local hands, adapted from Alastair's core design. The homes became warmer, safer, and consumed a fraction of the wood they once had. The frantic, panic scramble before winter was replaced by a calm, confident season of preparation. The community, once defined by its brute force struggle against the elements, was now defined by its resilience, its cleverness, its harmony with the harsh landscape it called home. Elara, the girl who had arrived with nothing but a worthless deed and a rusty key, became a revered matriarch, a living legend. She never sought power or authority, but she earned a measure of respect that men like Boren could only dream of. She remained in her small stone shelter on the mountain, a quiet, steadfast presence, the keeper of the hearth. Her home became a library, a school, a testament to the idea that true strength is not found in the loudness of one's voice, but in the quiet, patient application of wisdom. The story of the girl who tamed the wolf winter became a local fable, a lesson passed down to children about the hidden value in things society has discarded, and the profound, enduring power of a single, defiant mind to remake the world.